Any politically minded person who follows the political debate, be it on national level or international level, will have noticed an interesting, if not disturbing fact. Most intellectuals are left-leaning. Better yet, colleges and universities have become leftist strongholds. At first sight, one may believe that this proves the intellectual superiority of leftist ideologies over the right. Nothing could be further from the truth. Leftists need to resort to complex intellectual concepts to explain the ideological contradictions they constantly juggle with. To give a clear example, many leftists are strong believers in feminism. In the meantime, they are more often than not pro-Islam as well. This is especially the case in European countries that opened their border wide open to immigration coming from North Africa and/or the Middle East. Here's the issue, though. Feminists fight against the patriarchy. Islam, on the other hand, is a strongly patriarchal religion. Al-Baqarah verse 282 or An-Nisa verse 34 are two of the most infamous examples of patriarchy that is pervasive throughout the Quran and, more generally, in Islam. Yet, leftists manage to reconcile both seemingly contradictory ideologies. How? By over-intellectualizing the debate. That is, by resorting to rhetorical tricks and playing with semantics to confuse their audiences into believing there is some kind of logic in their argument. And here lies the main difference between a right-winger and a leftist. A right-winger is, in essence, an extremely down-to-earth being. He looks at reality and draws conclusions from what he sees with his own eyes, no matter how unsatisfactory the conclusion may be. Therefore, he doesn't need to intellectualize what he sees, using common vocabulary. He can easily explain his worldview, where he derives his worldview from, and how it impacts his life. The leftist, however, is an idealist. In his quest for utopia, his own leftist utopia, that is, the leftist cannot satisfy himself with the reality that contradicts his beliefs. In fact, a leftist can only be a pitiable being whose ideals always are, and always will be, rejected by nature and reality. In a sense, he is doomed to live a life of failure and frustration. As a result, his only alternative is to bend reality so as to make it fit his worldview. As such, and because reality stubbornly refuses to adhere to the leftist ideology, leftists must resort to intellectual tricks for their contradictions to disappear. Unfortunately, those contradictions only disappear in theory. For instance, a man cannot give birth to a child. This is a truth any right-winger will accept in a heartbeat. Leftists cannot accept this deeply unsatisfactory reality. This is why they will abuse semantics, modify the definition of words, come up with nonsensical neologisms that only make sense in their made-up universe, and other rhetorical subterfuges. By confusing the general public with seemingly scientific words the public has never heard of, which in reality are meaningless, and a heavy dose of bullying, it must be said, they manage to impose their worldview on the general public, most of whom don't care about those issues. Anyway, the transgender issue has become one of the most infamous examples. According to leftists, men can get pregnant. Obviously, any right-winger knows that this is impossible without needing to resort to esoteric vocabulary or perverting semantics to prove his point. Leftists, however, through the use of nonsensical neologisms such as cis-man and trans-man, will convince some people that, although quote-unquote cis-men can't get pregnant, quote-unquote trans-men can. Of course, from a strictly biological point of view, nothing differentiates these so-called trans men from regular women. This is all that matters to a right-winger. But the leftist will have to over-intellectualize reality to prove that this biological woman is now a man. Gender, identity, semantics, vague definitions are but a few tools the leftist will use to confuse himself. And this is the core issue. Leftist intellectuals may think they're smart. In reality, they're very confused and manage to confuse and manipulate inattentive people with vague concepts and words that they redefine to fit a very specific narrative when, in the collective mind, that word has a different meaning. In 2023, for instance, the once respected Johns Hopkins University modified the definition of the word lesbian. Traditionally, the term lesbian refers to a woman who's attracted to other women, a short and readily understandable and very specific definition. However, as the deconstructivist movement seems to have issues defining the term woman, they had to redefine the term lesbian without referring to women. As per Johns Hopkins University, a lesbian would henceforth be a non-man who is attracted to non-men. In doing so, They removed women from a concept that only applies to women. Better yet, as per this new definition, a woman can only be defined in direct reference to a man, or rather her quality of not being a man. One would think that this would enrage feminists, but, as we saw, leftists are very comfortable juggling with contradictions deriving from their over-intellectualizing simple concepts. Funnily, as per John Hopkins, all living beings, besides men, would literally fit the definition of a lesbian, as all animals, which are not men, are attracted to other animals. A lion, for instance, is attracted to a lioness, a boar to a sow. The list goes on. And even a magnet would fit the definition of a lesbian, as magnets, which are not men, are attracted to other magnets. Fortunately, Johns Hopkins University pulled their new definition of the term lesbian. On a different topic, the term racism is probably the very best example of such a word which definition has been modified by leftists to fit their narrative. Until recently, and to keep things simple, racism was the act of discriminating someone based on their complexion or religion. The problem, with this definition, is that black people could be racists as well. As a result, leftists carefully modified the definition of the term by adding the notion of power to ensure that only white people would fit the definition. This is all good and well in Europe and in the United States, where white people are in power. But this definition means that racism is no longer based on the behavior of people, but on the context. A white person in the United States will be a racist, no matter how kind he is, simply by virtue of being white in a white-led country. On the other hand, a white man uttering the vilest racist slurs in Nigeria cannot, as per the new definition, be called a racist, since white people are not in power in Nigeria. In Nigeria, however, all Nigerians are racists, according to the progressive definition of racism, since black people are in power in Nigeria, likewise, and still following the progressive definition of racism. There are 1.4 billion racist Chinese people in China. You can keep going on like this with each and every single country in the world. Moreover, if a white man, in the United States, is a racist by sheer virtue of his complexion, according to the leftist definition, there is no longer any moral or social incentive, other than through repression, for that white man to be kind to black people, since he'll be a racist whatever he does. In which case, you'd end up with what is commonly known as a self-fulfilling prophecy. Better yet, if racism is directly linked to power, then the issue of racism will never be solved, since there will always be one racial group that has more power than the other racial groups in any given country. Therefore, why would you even want to fight to solve an issue that cannot be solved? Fortunately for black Americans, right-wingers abide by the original definition of the term racism. In other words, right-wingers do believe that one's actions is what characterizes a person. As a result, only right-wingers could indeed put an end to racism. Of course, the smarter leftists among us will have noticed that this specific issue was not intellectualized by the leftist intelligentsia, or at least not in such terms. But it shows that, even at the most basic level, leftists have to pseudo-intellectualize any topic for their worldview to seemingly hold a modicum of water. The term racism had to be redefined. Otherwise, it would have been very hard to find a truly racist white person in the Western world. Similarly, gender had to be redefined for the entire leftist ideology around sex and transgenderism to make some kind of sense. Right-wingers, on this topic, were not plagued with such difficulties to prove what 200,000 years of human life on Earth has proven. Penis equals boy or man, vagina equals girl or woman. Short, simple, easy. And it has never failed humans in the last 200,000 years. Gender, somehow, never seemed to play the tiniest of roles in human reproduction. And here lies the true problem. By over-intellectualizing their favorite topics, leftists have alienated themselves from reality. The gender theories they invented is not intrinsically wrong, but it does not apply to the human being. In fact, gender theories, as theorized by leftist intellectuals, have an internal logic, as do most of their theories, but it simply does not apply to any living creature on Earth. Herein lies the difference between right-wingers and leftists. To simplify the dichotomy between both groups, right-wingers are realists, whereas leftists are ideologues. Otherwise put, right-wingers study reality and derive theoretical models from reality. Leftists, on the other hand, come up with ideas first, which they then impose on the real world, even though said ideas are not compatible with reality. Marxism, and more broadly, communism as a whole, is a perfect example of the way leftists work. Marx and Engels first came up with a communist model in the late 19th century, which was then imposed on Russia and later the Soviet Union in the 20th century, and the Soviet Union miserably collapsed less than 3/4 of a century later. History proved Marxism to be incompatible with human societies, but this didn't stop subsequent regimes from trying to impose altered forms of communism on their people, which all, without a single exception, further proved this ideology to be a catastrophe. Until leftists realize that they apprehend life from the wrong angle, they will come up with more ideas that will cost the lives of millions of people and destroy leftists themselves. One cannot impose purely intellectual ideas upon reality without taking into account the very nature of the reality one tries to alter. At some point, leftists will have to remember that it is the conservative West that prevailed when the communist Eastern Bloc collapsed. They will have to remember that the strictly communist China of Mao led to rampant poverty and the death of 60 million people, but that it is only when China opened up to capitalism and the market economy that the Chinese economy and society soared to never-before-seen levels. Leftists may think they are smart, based on the intellectual works they have produced, but reality proves, every single day, that they are nothing but a destructive force. But destroying is easy. It doesn't require any particular skill. Now would be time to actually build something.